Hello and willkommen to this very first episode of the Zeitgeist podcast by me, Katja Heuer, a German historian with a mild obsession for her birth country's history. You're listening to the podcast of my Zeitgeist Substack, which is a forum that will hopefully capture some of my conversations about Germany's past, present, and maybe even its future. Who knows? It's really a brand new thing, and the beauty of it is that we can take it wherever this community of readers and listeners wanted to go. So feel free to let me know your thoughts, questions, or comments. I'm very pleased to say that this very first episode starts the Zeitgeist podcast off with a bit of historical stardust. I'm delighted to welcome Roger Moorhouse. Roger is a historian and author specializing in modern Germany and Central European history with a particular interest in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and World War II in Europe. He is also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Warsaw and the author of a number of excellent books on modern Germany and modern German history, including Killing Hitler, Berlin at War, The Third Reich in 100 Objects, The Devil's Alliance, Hitler's Pact with Stalin, 1939 to 1941, and First to Fight, the British War, 1939. Roger is a regular commentator in the specialist and general press, and also a consultant for film and television. But today he's here to speak to me about his new book, The Forgers, The Forgotten History of the Holocaust's Most Audacious Rescue Operation, available now in all good bookshops. Hello, Roger. Welcome to Zeitgeist.
Hello, Katja. Thank you very much for having me.
And thanks for being here. I'm very delighted to have you, of all people, here to speak about, not German history, obviously, but Central European history as well, and broaden the scope a little bit. Can you tell us a bit about your book to start with? Who were the forgers that are in your title?
Yeah, the Forgers. It was a group of 6 individuals, Polish diplomats and Jewish activists, if you like, aid activists, who were all working out of Bern in Switzerland. This was capital during World War II. It's colloquially known generally as the Ładoś Group, and that's after the ambassador himself, Alexander Ładoś, who headed it up. And they came together in 1940, 41, and essentially they were being inundated with demands for help from primarily Polish Jews who were still in German-occupied Poland. They had assisted a few individuals on a sort of ad hoc basis in 1941 already with paperwork and with passports and so on. And this sort of was known amongst on the grapevine of those Jews in occupied Poland. So they began to be sort of inundated with demands for passports and paperwork to people trying to escape the Holocaust, essentially. So that they sort of formed together from that very ad hoc sort of organic beginning. They got together and started what was basically a sort of cottage industry, producing Latin American passports, primarily Paraguayan passports, illegally in Bern. With the help of the Paraguayan honorary consul, who was a Swiss by the name of Rudolf Hügli. And they, by 1944, beginning of 1944, by the time the operation was closed down by the Swiss police, it's estimated that they had produced documents for around 10,000 people, which makes this a very significant Holocaust rescue operation. And it's one that really wasn't known about until about 5 years ago. So it's very new.
Yeah, and it's quite astonishing, really, when you think the scale of it. What you just described is really quite an extensive undertaking and in a field that is actually quite well researched. So it's quite surprising that this wasn't such a known story. In your subtitle, you even call it a forgotten story, which is somewhat of a risky claim given that there are so many books out on the Holocaust. I was quite struck by Sam Leith in the Spectator, who actually reviewed your book extremely favorably as a very positive review. But he did say that dozens and dozens of supposedly forgotten or untold stories of the Holocaust era, pass across his desk every year. So were the heroes of your story really forgotten? And if so, how did you find out about them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And actually, to clarify, Sam Leith in his review, he did say, as you suggest, he said that lots of claims to forgotten status are made, but he did say that this one genuinely does appear to have been forgotten.
No, that's what struck me as well, reading it. It's one of those things that is really big and it's a genuinely new thing about the Holocaust in the field that is actually very well explored.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reminder, I suppose, for us as historians that, there is new stuff out there and significant new stuff where, in a way we just have to sort of look a bit harder and be a bit more imaginative. But that particular rant aside, this one really was forgotten because the main reason is that there are two ways in which sort of narratives, if you like, stories from the Holocaust or indeed any other subject sort of make their way into the historiography. One of which is through, from official documents, the records of the governments and the diplomats and all the rest of it. And the other is from individual testimony. So from the top in one respect and from the bottom in another. And in this case, neither sort of pathway worked. The official pathway didn't work because, as we know, Poland was taken over by the Red Army and then by the communists in 1945. They essentially, cut off the Polish government in exile, which had been in London and had been in charge of, the whole sort of diplomatic network of Poland. And Poland, of course, never formally surrendered in World War II. So it kept its government in exile, and that was sort of controlling that diplomatic network and controlling the Polish underground as well, crucially. So all of that was cut off. So the records on the official level were mostly in London, but also in Warsaw. But they were essentially sidelined by that political act. And of course, the communists in Warsaw had no interest in praising and glamorizing what the wartime government had done. So that route effectively was closed off. And then on the other side, the sort of personal testimony route was closed off as well, because of those thousands of people who received, in shorthand, we can call them Ładoś passports, but documents from the Ładoś group. First of all, you had to survive the Holocaust, which was a tough ask. I mean, for all of those, they were taken out of the deportation lines, but they were sent to Belsen as a sort of holding camp for these what were thought to be foreign Jews. You had to survive 18 months in Belsen, which is a tough ask, to survive the war. So that was a difficult thing. And then you had to, have written some sort of memoir or some account of your survival. And the vast majority of them that received those papers, assuming that they survived and wrote all of those, their experiences down, the vast majority knew nothing or next to nothing about where the passport had come from. So they didn't necessarily have that correspondence with Ładoś and his diplomatic colleagues or anything else. They had perhaps a contact in Switzerland who was adjacent to or had personally had contact with the Ładoś group. So very often, the idea that there was some sort of Paraguayan passport that saved them, most of them were Paraguayan passports, that was all they knew. They didn't know where it came from, or the background to it, or who had prepared it, or whatever. So both of those paths meant that this story just didn't enter the public narrative of the Holocaust. So it really has been forgotten.
That's so interesting, isn't it? At the middle level, basically between the big story and individual testimony, you've got actually potentially a whole field of kind of interactions, of networks. Especially because so many people, obviously perish. It's a particular problem with Holocaust studies that you basically end up with a lot of knowledge that just wasn't passed on or down to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's precisely right. And to go to your question of how did it arrive with me? This really surfaced about what are we now? It's about 7 years ago, I suppose. But then Polish ambassador in Switzerland, whose name was Jakub Kumow, he was having a reception in his residence or in the embassy building. And one of his guests said, well, referred to the building as a holy place. And he said, well, he was confused and asked what this gentleman meant. And he was told about this wartime operation that saved hundreds of thousands, perhaps thousands of Jews. And he hadn't heard of it, so he set one of his staff off to do some research, and then this story began to emerge. So I was informed about this. This has been bubbling along in sort of the Polish press and a little bit in the Swiss press as well. There'd been a few minor reports about it written in the years that followed, and then it sort of arrived on my desk, an email from a friend of mine who said, this story is kind of bubbling along. You might want to have a look at it, and I did, and I just thought this, as I said, it's a fascinating story. It had lots of human aspect to it, if you like, which is what we kind of want as historians, right? You want something human to sort of deal with, and emotional hook for the readers and so on.
Yeah, and also to make this vast history more relatable and understandable.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so complicated and so big that it's often quite difficult to break down to the personal level.
And of course it was new, which was catnip to me. I just thought that was a great thing. It's a new story from the Holocaust, and it's a positive story from the Holocaust, which is it's pretty tough to find anything positive out of the Holocaust. But I thought this was a great story, and I took it on that basis.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I also like the way that in the book you link it kind of back to the bigger events and take your readers basically with you, even if you know nothing about the topic or about the kind of details of the history of the Holocaust more widely. Your book's very accessible to everyone. So one of the things, for instance, that you start off with is actually tracing the response of the international community to the increasing persecution of Jews in Europe and the increasing kind of desperation that refugees faced. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? So when and how did the world begin to recognize that the situation for European Jews was increasingly desperate, and what did they decide to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought was a crucial piece of context. I mean, my job as you'll know, Katja, when you start on a new project, you kind of have to work out the architecture of the book, as it were, how you're going to present the material, what the narrative arc is going to be. And having sort of read around it, I could see that, the international reaction was a crucial part of this. And I think it's not as clear cut, and it's not as positive as I think we might ordinarily imagine, particularly if we sort of look back with rose-tinted hindsight. And I think we tend to imagine the outside world, once the Holocaust gets going after 41, I think we tend to imagine the outside world kind of willing and able to help, but sort of held back by logistical concerns or strategic concerns, which are valid, of course. But sort of fundamentally willing to help, and perhaps held back by a lack of knowledge of precisely what's going on. So that aspect of what was known when and how that information came out was also something I wanted to address. So I thought that was all sort of rather crucial context to what was going on. But this idea, this assumption that the outside world is kind of fundamentally benign and is just stymied for various reasons and can't act, I think it's fundamentally mistaken, because the outside world, as far as I can tell from writing this book and researching it, is at best indifferent to the suffering of the Jews. And you can see it right the way, from the late 1930s onwards. Admittedly, Holocaust isn't yet happening, but the attitude fundamentally doesn't change. And I actually start the book as a prologue. I think chapter 1, actually. I start with the Evian Conference of 1938, which was an extended exercise in sort of buck passing. The international community gets together supposedly to address the refugee crisis, which resulted out of the Anschluss with Austria in the spring of 1938. So they meet in July of 38 at Evian. As I say, they're basically, the Europeans say, well, we're full, so it's up to the rest of the world to take the lead and let these thousands of people in. And the rest of the world says, no, it's not our problem, it's a European problem. So, you Europeans have to solve it. And in the end, there's a lot of hot air and there's a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of sympathy, but precisely nothing is done to assist those, tens of thousands of Austrian Jews who are trying to escape Austria at the time. And as I say, this is, of course, before the Holocaust, but you can see the same mentality is expressed there's a subsequent meeting in 1943 at Bermuda between the British and the Americans, which also does precisely nothing to assist the Jews. then there's the attitudes are fundamentally the same. It's that this is a problem that which will solve itself when we win the war, and we don't. It's not serious enough that we have to do anything about it now, and it's just sort of kicking the can down the road. And they can't claim ignorance of what was going on, because, as I say in the book, from the end of 42 onwards, effectively, there's sufficient intelligence available, which has been pieced together, and primarily by the Polish underground, incidentally, and was brought to the attention of the outside world by the Polish government in exile. There's enough information there to make it plain that the Holocaust is ongoing and is as serious as we now know that it was. So that whole wider context of the Western reaction and the Western inaction, I think, is really, really important, because what stands out of that is that actually the Polish government in exile, this might surprise a few people, the Polish government in exile was really exemplary in engaging in the way that it did, and it was up against the State Department, the American government to a large extent, the diplomatic community, trying to do its best to save lives, and the rest of the world was fundamentally, at best, indifferent.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. I mean, it's hard to not see this as a callous response when you consider kind of just the immensity of the crimes that took place in Europe and would take place in Europe.
Yeah.
But you do take great care in the book to present us a somewhat more nuanced approach regarding this. So what do you make of the response of the international world? Is it down to indifference, or is there a kind of latent anti-Semitism? Does that play a role?
I think there is a latent anti-Semitism, to be honest. I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between that sort of, as one might call it, old-fashioned anti-Semitism, and the kind of metastasized, murderous anti-Semitism that the Nazis are espousing at this point. They're very different animals. Now, I think that the anti-Semitism of sort of Western politicians is more one of I mean, it was said at the time that when these reports came out, and Western politicians would say, "Oh, it's just the Jews sort of overreacting, and it's not a big problem." It's kind of these are not people that we need to really worry about. We can kind of ignore it. That we'll win the war, and then this can all be this will all come out in the wash, and it won't be a problem. So it's more of a sort of an indifference, but influenced by a latent anti-Semitism, I would say.
Yeah.
I think it is important to differentiate between that sort of anti-Semitism and what the Nazis were doing there, however, because I think that's it's a dangerous assumption to assume that if you describe someone as anti-Semitic that it's the same as what the Nazis were doing, because I think there are shades of grey in there.
Yeah, and you make that distinction really clear in the book that it is very nuanced, and you describe the different kind of strands and reasons for the inaction, really, of the rest of the world very clearly and very well, I find. Yeah. It's interesting, as you say, that despite that, for instance, the Polish government in exile, but also some individuals took it upon themselves to do something and to help, and often they did so at great personal risk. The hero of your book, Audacious, is one such person. What motivated him to do something to help the victims of the Holocaust, and who was he kind of as a person?
Yeah, it's a good question. He came from Lvov, modern day Lviv in Ukraine. He had been a junior diplomat through the interwar period, so he'd been present at the negotiating party at the Treaty of Minsk, for example, in what was that, 1921, I think it was. So he'd been consul general in Munich in the late 1920s. So he'd sort of, he'd been around. He was a junior diplomat, and his career was sort of derailed really by the coup that Józef Pilsudski took power in Poland in 1926, and Ładoś, along with others, was one of those that sort of protested against this sort of suspension of democratic politics in Poland. and was effectively sidelined. His career couldn't really continue from then on. So he became a sort of politician on the. He was a member of the Peasant Party, actually. So his politics are quite peculiar. It's a Peasant Party is sort of socially conservative, but economically quite left. So it's sort of centre left, really, but very centre. So a curious mixture of political stances, actually. And he came, as I said, he came from Lvov, which has this very, very strong Jewish strand in its history and in its traditions, which you can see in Philip Sands' book a few years ago. East-West Street is essentially, set very similar small town close to Lvov. It shows that sort of that world that he came from very, very, very clearly. And then in 1939, like others, he escapes out through Romania, ends up in Paris with the government in exile, and as then the sort of the most senior representative of the Peasant Party, he's given a position in the exile government in 1940, which he's then he's usurped from. So he ends up being sent out as someone who was considered reliable. He's sent out as a diplomat. And Switzerland was somewhere where they needed someone they could trust. The government in exile, they needed someone who was, on side with what they were trying to do and so on. He was considered that man. So he sent to Switzerland in April of 1940. And crucially, in sort of describing his mindset, there are two factors that we need to bring into this. And one is that supposedly on his escape from Poland in 1939, down into Romania, he'd been helped along the way by an ordinary Jewish family, and he half wrote a memoir which wasn't finished and was never published, but he talked about how that had I suppose coloured his attitude towards the Jews. I think he already came from a background which was broadly sympathetic, but that that he was assisted in his escape by ordinary Polish Jews. Really cemented that sort of sympathy for the Jewish plight. And secondarily, going back to the First World War, when he was a young man, he was he was in the growing up in the Austrian partition of the Austrian area of Galicia of Poland, and was sentenced to internal exile for pro-Polish agitation, and was sent to the Tyrol in Austria, and promptly escaped with, you guessed it, a forged passport. So in a sense, he like many other Poles of that generation, this aspect, and I bring this up in the book, this aspect of the Polish word konspiracja, meaning life in conspiratorial circles, shall we say, life in the underground, was not just a theory. It was something that many of them had actually lived. They'd lived through it during the partition and during the First World War. So that even though that he's a very respectable man and is appointed ambassador to Switzerland, that's very much in his makeup that he has personally benefited in his life from a forged passport. He consequently is not afraid of forging paperwork, which is remarkable for an ambassador. He's not afraid of forging paperwork for a higher cause. So that's a sort of peculiarly Polish aspect, I think, of his makeup, because there are lots of other diplomats in World War II and just before World War II who are doing similar things. You think of someone like Thomas Kendrick in Vienna. There was a Chinese individual, Ho Fengshan, Kiyune Sugihara in Kaunas in Lithuania. There are other examples, but I think this one with the Ładoś group is peculiar because of that sort of peculiarly Polish flavour to it. That they, and interestingly, poles apart from the attitude of the Swiss, who are absolutely punctilious and correct about paperwork, and the idea that a public official, a senior diplomat would not only tolerate but actively involve himself in the forging of official documents. To the Swiss mind is absolutely unthinkable, then as now, right? And yet for the Poles, as I said, with their traditions, this is kind of, well, that's fair game. This is how you do things. This is how you get things done in extremis. is that you sometimes have to break the rules. Get over it. So the two attitudes are sort of poles apart. Just punning aside. And I love that aspect. I think that's really fascinating. And the Swiss really, really didn't like it. They tried very hard to shut the Waddash group down. But those two attitudes, I think, are fascinating.
So you have someone from a sort of background who's quite open-minded towards doing things in a slightly creative way, shall we say? Someone who's already fairly sympathetic towards the Jewish plight, someone who wants to help a fellow Pole. I think you can go as far as that, also to say that we always distinguish between sort of Jewish people and citizens of specific countries, be that Poland or Germany or Austria, as if they were two separate things. But for many Jews, of course, they were Poles at the same time as being Jews. So he's already got that sort of mindset as well.
We forget that that half of the dead of the Holocaust are Polish Jews. It's very much a subject that's entwined in Polish history. You can't sort of separate out the two. And I think this is something that I think is one of the sort of errors, if you like, of Holocaust historiography up to now, is that there's a tendency to view the Holocaust almost exclusively through a sort of Jewish prism, and to separate it out from its hinterland, if you like, particularly from that Polish hinterland. And I think that it's important to view it in the round. It's a much more complex and nuanced story, and painful story, than we've necessarily understood before.
Absolutely. It seems to me that people like Ladosh themselves saw it that way. They were also helping fellow Poles escape. But sort of once he'd made up his mind, how did he go about doing it? So just talk us through the mechanics, if you will, of his plan.
Yeah. So as I said, they start getting these sort of desperate, letters from occupied Poland, from the ghettos and so on. People asking for help, and they had already helped a few people on an ad hoc basis, with paperwork. One of which, incidentally, was the French Jewish politician Pierre Mendès France, who was provided with a Polish passport, actually, by the Waddash group, so that he could escape Vichy France in 1941. So they'd already sort of assisting people on an ad hoc basis. And then really from late 41, early 42 onwards, then it begins to become a bit more systematic. And they need to raise funds. So a lot of the funding is supplied by their Jewish comrades, the representatives of the aid agencies and so on, and later on by the government in exile as well. It's quite a funny story that the government in exile actually contacts Waddash in 1943 and says to him that they've heard, the rumor that it might be possible to forge Latin American passports to help Jews to escape the Holocaust. Could they investigate? And they're basically telling Waddash that about his own scheme that he's been doing for 2 years, effectively, because he kept it quiet. He'd been operational security meant that he kept quiet what he was doing. You told as few people as possible. So he then went back and confessed to them and said, "Well, I've actually been doing that. Thank you very much. It is me that's been doing it." And they said, "Well, jolly good, carry on. And what can we do to help?" and so on, which is, I suppose, must have been a relief to them. So anyway, they've got this honorary consul who will supply the blank passports, mainly for Paraguay. About 70% of what they supplied were Paraguayan passports, and a lesser document called a promesa, which is just a sort of a certificate of citizenship, if you like, that didn't have a photograph and so on, but it was much cheaper to provide. So about 70% of them are Paraguayan, and these are filled out by Wadash's staff. Most of the paperwork is done by a chap called Konstanty Rokicki, who's one of his staff. Has very distinctive handwriting that you can see on all these documents, and then they're taken back to Hugli to be stamped and signed in the usual way. So again, there's a slight query over the whole aspect of them being forged, because in a way they're illegally produced. They're produced effectively in the normal way, but illegally. So forgers is probably, that's a word that some might take issue with, but it's as good a title as any. And then those documents are notarized, and notarized copies are made, and then they're sent into, often by post even, they're sent into occupied Poland, and later on there's a large number sent into Holland as well. And effectively this preserves the recipients from onward deportation to the death camps by the Germans, because one of the preconditions, this is something I think I certainly hadn't really fully appreciated before, one of the preconditions for the extermination of the Jews during the Holocaust was that the Germans made an extra legal space, we can call it. They made an extra legal space, a space beyond law, where they could put these people prior to their onward deportation. Now that's usually the ghettos or whatever it is. And actually for German Jews particularly, this is quite a stark example. For German Jews deported, and those deportations start late in 1941, deported out of Berlin and Hamburg and other cities very often into occupied Poland, into places like Łódź or like Warsaw, or further east to Kaunas or Minsk or wherever it is. There was an aspect of that deportation was that as soon as they crossed the German frontier, any documents that they had effectively legally lapsed. Were considered invalid at that point. And that was written into German law. So they are consciously creating an extra legal space into which to put these people. And what the passports do is to reassert some sort of legal framework, however spurious it might be. It reasserts some sort of legal representation. So if you can imagine, a Polish Jew in the Warsaw ghetto who is about to be deported, and he holds up his Paraguayan passport and he says, "You can't do this to me, I'm a Paraguayan citizen." And it doesn't matter that he only speaks Yiddish. He doesn't know where Paraguay is, and his name's Yitzhak Feldman. It doesn't matter, because the guards will say, "Oh, crikey, we've got another one," and you'd be sent to Belsen. Actually, you wouldn't be sent on to Auschwitz. You'd be pulled out of the line, and you'd be sent to Belsen, because the Germans had made a sort of virtue out of this. The fact that there were apparently so many foreign Jews in their control at this point, that they wanted to collect up foreign Jews, and they saw that they could leverage them in some way. So they reclassified them as what they called exchange Jews. These were people that could be exchanged for Germans abroad, right? And there were many more Germans abroad than there were, foreign Jews in Europe. So they collected them up, and they sent them largely to Belsen, others to a camp in France called Vittel, and kept them alive in relatively, I stress relatively, good conditions. Weren't forced to work for much of that period, for example. They're allowed to keep their own clothes and so on. So in better conditions than many of the other prisoners in Belsen, certainly. And they were kept for some future exchange. In the vast majority of cases, that exchange never happened. So, if you were lucky, let's put it this way, if you were lucky and you had one of these passports, you got sent to Belsen in 1943. If you were lucky, you had to survive Belsen for 2 years to survive the Holocaust, which is a tough ask, right? But the key thing is that passport allowed you to escape the deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau or to Treblinka and to the death camps. So that, it's crucial in that respect that it gave them at least a chance of life.
Yeah, and what your book does really well, I think, is this is just one small aspect really of the huge history that is, the Holocaust. Effectively, it's just one part of the entire big story that shows that some people were actually trying to do something about it, were trying to help, and you break it down to a level, I think, that makes some of it more accessible. It makes it, as you say, these insights into the idea that, even just a kind of assumption of some form of legal framework actually sometimes made a difference is something I think that's very hard to comprehend in this entire sort of extremely messy and extremely unpleasant part of human history, really. And I think one thing that also really stands out in your book is the many people in it, just humans, individuals that aren't, statistics or numbers, because I think there's always a a risk when you tell the history of the Holocaust that you basically end up talking about groups of people that are very difficult to imagine as individuals or as people. But the people in your book have got names, they got stories, they got background, and you can kind of access their story more easily. Was there an individual, apart from Ladosh and the Ladosh group, was there an individual that you came across in your research that you would like to highlight here?
I suppose that it is a very human story. I wanted it to be that. With a lot of this, there's no shortage of really, really poignant, painfully poignant stories from the Holocaust. Obviously. So I really wanted to sort of harness as much of that stuff as I could, because it's a great way in for the reader. It's very emotive stuff. I suppose there's one story that I did found. There's some amazing characters. There's a chap called Louis Tass, who was a Dutch Jew who had one of these passports, and he ended up in Belsen, as many did, and survived Belsen. And I loved his sort of tone. He had this sort of very wry, you could almost say sarcastic sort of view of the world, which I suppose is a result of his experiences as a young man. But he sort of looked at the world with a shrug and crikey, what's going to happen now? That sort of attitude. And it comes across in his he wrote diaries, and these were published under a pseudonym post-war. And his wry look at the world, I just thought was sometimes laugh out loud funny, which I loved. And there's a few quotes from him in the book which I thought were brilliant. So of course I used them. One story that that still stays with me, and I think this, it really should. This aspect of it could be a Hollywood film. One of the people that ended up in Belsen was a Warsaw Jew who went under the name of Professor Eisenman, and he was very sort of taciturn. He had this terrified look in his eye, as many did, after their experiences of watching experiencing the liquidation of the ghetto, for example, in 1943, and then being deported, not knowing where they were going, and so on, end up in Belsen, not really understanding what the future holds. And very often they've seen people killed, they've had family members that disappeared into the death camps, and so on. So these are really brutalized people. So Eisenman always had this terrified look in his eye. And eventually the story comes out of what had happened to him. So he went by this name of Professor Eisenman. He wasn't a professor at all, apparently. He was a Warsaw gravedigger, and he'd found the body of the real Professor Eisenman in the street during the liquidation of the ghetto in 1943. And he'd realised that the Professor Eisenman had a sort of passing resemblance to him. So he sort of rifled through the professor's pockets and found his identity papers, which included a Paraguayan passport, right? Because he'd already obviously applied and received one. So he put all this in his pocket, and then was subsequently himself identified as an exchange Jew, and as taking the identity of Professor Eisenman, was sent to Belsen. At which point he was sort of terrified, because there he was, a very simple man who only spoke Yiddish, didn't understand what was going on around him. And was sort of terrified of revealing his true identity, even to his fellow prisoners, because he thought that would be the end. He'd be identified as the simple gravedigger, and would be sent to his death. So he was absolutely terrified, and eventually told one of his fellow prisoners in Belsen of this story. And they sort of they sympathised and helped him through it. And in the end, he actually got exchanged. Nobody betrayed his real identity. But he actually got exchanged, and presumably his recipients, the people that met him, expecting Professor Eisenman, and they were met by a Yiddish-speaking gravedigger. It's such a wonderful story. So there are sort of this is the thing. Even in the story, as utterly, unendingly grim and horrific as the Holocaust, there are still little flashes of light and empathy and love, even. That you can find in the record and you can pull out. And I think that, in a way, particularly those stories, you kind of need that. You need to have little human moments in that narrative, and I hope I've done that.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially researching it. You do describe awful, sometimes almost unthinkable acts of cruelty in the book as well. And I'm sure you came across a lot more in your research too. How do you deal with holding this sort of history in your head, researching it, whilst also going about your daily life? Do you try and shut out what you learn, or do you try and take time to process it? Or?
Well, I'm sure you have a similar thing, particularly with your work on the GDR as well, Katya. You've come across horrors, maybe not as visceral necessarily as the Holocaust, or as intense as the Holocaust, but still, they're horrors nonetheless. And in a way, you get hardened to them, which is a kind of sad thing to say, but you do get hardened to them. You keep them at one remove. So there's a part of you as a writer and as a historian that reads these accounts and goes, oh my God, that's amazing. That's brilliant material, if you like. I mean, it's horrific. But in a way, your writer's mind is saying, okay, that's brilliant. I can use that. Right? That's really emotive. That's really great piece of a great human story. I can use that. And it's actually quite rare, I find, that the material you're reading kind of penetrates this sort of that detachment. But sometimes it does. And there's a couple of examples. There was one that I read, and I tell the story in the book. Of a woman who was in Belsen, and she had on the transport to Belsen, she was so convinced that they were being deported to their deaths that she pushed her infant son out of the train carriage, and as you can imagine, never saw him again. And then she realized that actually she was in a safer place. When she was in Belsen, she realized she was actually in a safer place than he was, wherever he was. So she spent every night she used to sort of, scream out in her sleep and say, where's my son? What have I done with him? And so on. And blaming herself for it. And reading stories like that, on the one hand, you think, yes, that's great. I'll use that. That's really good material. And then at some point it sort of creeps up on you and you go, my God, that is absolutely horrific. So that occasionally you get, these stories, they do literally creep up on you, at night when you can't sleep or whatever it is, or at different moments, it would just creep up on you. And the sheer horror of what these individuals endured, is suddenly very, very real. So it's, there are defense mechanisms, I think, which kick in, but sometimes, they get circumvented.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, especially when there's something in what you read or what you research that speaks to you personally, for whatever reason. But sometimes there are ways in which the situation of the person reminds you of something in your own life, or people remind you of people that you know. So I know exactly what you mean, trying to shut things out and viewing them from an academic's point of view. Only goes so far sometimes that doesn't quite
it creeps up on you, or the sheer weight of it. I mean, it is doing work on. I hadn't written anything really directly on the Holocaust before, and it is like peering into the abyss sometimes. So I'm not going to hurry to do it again, to be honest. But it's thoroughly brutal.
Well, thank you for coming along and talking to us about this subject. Even though it isn't always easy, but you do tell an incredibly important story, and I think one that deserved to be preserved and told and spread to wider audiences. And I certainly hope that many of my readers and my listeners will feel inspired to buy and read your book, because it is not only an important story, but also very grippingly told, with all of these individuals and human stories in it too. Incidentally, the audiobook is excellent as well, read very impactfully by the author himself. So you can give yourself a pat on the shoulder for that one. No, I do think you read it very, with the sort of real sense that you care about the story that you tell. Your tone, your voice, the pace, and things all kind of work really well with the story that you tell. So, best of luck with the book, and thank you for coming on to talk about it.
Lovely, thank you. My great pleasure. Thanks very much.
Well, and there you have it, the very first episode of the Zeitgeist podcast, and I hope you found it as interesting as I have. Please consider becoming a free or a paid subscriber to my Zeitgeist Substack to support my work. And other than that, auf Wiedersehen und bis zum nächsten Mal.